Welcome back, everybody. This is Dr. A on History Surfer. This is an art appreciation lecture on the Baroque period. The Baroque period is really started by the Counter-Reformation, whereby the church sought to counter the Protestant Reformation and draw people back. And so the emphasis on the art beginning in this period is going to be physical size as well as the range of emotions of humans. So unlike the Renaissance, which kind of focused on the reasonable aspects of humanity, the Baroque will indeed focus on those things that make us, different, the emotions that we display. The cradle of the Baroque was in Italy. And as you can see here from this map I'm showing, it was a time where the Catholics were being threatened by the Protestants, and that's the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Anglicans. And so those churches were considered plain churches. And so what the Catholic Church decided to do was create things that were much, much more opulent. Like I said, big, oversized things, lots of emotions, lots of movement. So let's begin by looking at the biggest project during the Baroque period in Rome is St. Peter's. St. Peter's had been started a redoing of it in the year 1000, and it was because it was in such bad condition. The person who received some of the biggest works was Gianlorenzo Bernini. And Bernini is going to be in doing this big open square space. He had two, that Egyptian obelisk to work with and two fountains. And so what he did, he connected these curving curving colonnades. You see them here, all right? So they replicated the embracing arms of the church, reaching out to the world. And it's a big space, and Bernini's workshop was furiously busy creating this new dynamic architecture, really. It's reaching out to us and pulling us in. As we spoke about during the Renaissance period, those of you who have taken my class know that was Michelangelo's contribution. And now we have these embracing arms of the church. On the facade of the building, we see Christ and the Apostles. Bernini's doing that. Bernini's a great sculptor and an architect. And so he does those. If you look at that schematic, you can see who they are and where they are. And then here on the top of the that colonnade, you see those figures there, and they are the popes from the church. So we have a big project going on. St. Peter's is a huge, huge, huge building. It's the biggest Christian church in the world. And Bernini also works on the interior, designing and building the baldacchino. The baldacchino covers the grave of St. Peter's. It was begun in 1624 and completed in 1633. He used so much gold leaf, in fact the entire inside of the church did, that they ran out of gold leaf. In Europe, they stripped the interior of the Pantheon of its gold leaf. The baldacchino is the crowning jewel of the inside of the of the church. It's huge. Now, what you're looking at is different views of it, and you can see it's got these twisting columns going up. The high altar is right here. And this is the spirit of the Baroque, everyone. I mean, this is it. Big, grandiose, elaborate. This is so big, it's almost, it's almost considered architectural. It's so huge. The interior of the church mandated that. With such a large building, they needed something that would, make that statement. Bernini's work characterizes the Baroque in Italy. And Italy isn't, the heart of it. It's an Italian phenomenon. There you see it. Not only does he do things like this for the church, but he's very busy, and he also does a lot of sculpture. Here you see the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. It's typically Baroque, and it's typically Bernini. Bernini uses a dynamic swirling of the folds of her gown. You see that here. You see how she's not just passively accepting what's happened. He shows you the moment of the saint's interaction with the angel who pierced her with a flaming arrow of divine love. She was a Spanish mystic who started the Discalced Carmelites. That means no shoes. It had an intensity to it that a lot of people found uncomfortable, but look at how her robes swirl around. Look at her face. This is not about someone who's detached. She's totally overtaken by this ecstasy. Excuse me. He also did things from mythology. Here's Pluto and Proserpina. It shows the moment that Proserpina was carried into the underworld by Pluto. And look at how this thing reaches out and swirls in space. It's almost like we see this kind of spiral developing here. Look closely at it and you can see how great Bernini was at showing us skin. I mean, he is considering himself the Michelangelo of his age. Certainly he deserves that. He's not Michelangelo, though, and so his David will not be thinking about what he's doing. Instead, the Baroque spirit says, capture the moment. Look at David, how he clenches his mouth as he's getting ready to fling the stone. His body in this very severe contrapposto, twisting. And so it's all about that moment. And so the moment's, definitely emphasized here. Of the great Italian Baroque artists, Michelangelo Caravaggio was one of the youngest and one of the most original. His personal life captivates people because he is definitely violently antisocial. He displayed strong homosexual tendencies early in his life, and he was a tortured individual. There's a lot of great novels about Caravaggio. There's been some work done on him, but he definitely is someone who is a contradiction. In this early work, we see him developing in his Bacchus, his famous use of chiaroscuro. He is a master at it. The lights and the darks. And he's really one of the first people to emphasize the use of this kind of still life in his imagery. The conversion of St. Paul. Again, look at that moment. Here's a man who's arrested for beating people up. He has violent fights with people, and yet he can do these unbelievable religious scenes. Excuse me. You see the light shining down here? The light is a big component of Baroque work. It's dramatic. It's theatrical. It's like a spotlight. As St. Paul reaches into the air, grasping the light that it's coming to him, he's being, he's experiencing like St. Teresa did, that moment of divine love. Perhaps one of his most famous images is the calling of St. Matthew. Again, look at that use of chiaroscuro. That light dramatically enters the room. And there's Christ. We see that very subtle halo. And look at the gesture. It's definitely Michelangelo's from the Sistine Chapel. He's calling this group of young men. Note too, they're attired in the dress of that period. These are actually, or so my instructor told me, thugs who were friends with Caravaggio. Caravaggio's poignant work totally characterizes the Baroque, and he's very influential on other Baroque painters. They will look to him again and again and again and again. His inspiration is far-reaching. Unfortunately for him, he never really, comes to grips with his own life. Continuing to work, doing religious themes and biblical stories. Eventually, Caravaggio ends up imprisoned for his violent behavior and as a force to leave Rome. When we get to his influence and his followers, in this image here, we have Judith beheading Holofernes. What we're going to see is his influence on one of the most, I don't want to say controversial, maybe infamous artists of the period, and that is Artemisia Gentileschi. She is the most famous woman of the period. Artemisia found her calling in art because of her father. He was a man who was a painter, Orazio Gentileschi, and she trained under him and was showing great talent when Orazio decided to hire a man to help her learn how to do painting. All right. Unfortunately, that did not end well for her, and Artemisia was raped by this man. She accuses it, well, her father actually ends up catching them. And he had promised her he would marry her. He was a little bit older. She was quite young. And she finds out he's already married, and so her father accuses him of the rape. They go to papal court, and Artemisia is on trial, with her rapist. She has to testify. In this period, you had to prove you weren't telling a lie, and so she too had to be tortured. Believe it or not, they physically tortured her. And she never recanted. Unfortunately, her rapist received a very mild sentence and never left the city of Rome. She herself was shamed. But she begins to paint these imagery where you see her working out her anger and her shame and her problems and getting revenge on this man. His name was Tazi, his last name. And here you see her doing Judith beheading Holofernes, and she puts herself in the position of Judith, and that's Tazi is Holofernes. Look at the difference. Here, this Judith looks kind of reluctant in Caravaggio's version to cut off Holofernes' head. Not this Judith. She's into it. And she does this a couple of different times, not just once. She does these images that purge her of her trauma. She becomes very well known. In fact, she becomes a court painter in the court of Naples. She's very upset with her father over all the events that happened. She was publicly humiliated. And she does all these images that talk about the humiliation. This one, Susanna and the Elders, there she is again. That's her father, and that's Tazi. Here's one where she is posing as Lucrezia. So she uses herself. So let's talk about that phenomena. Female artists can use their own images and sell them. Not so much male artists, but definitely female artists have a market for that. And so it's interesting that, Artemisia capitalizes on that. She poses herself here as the matron of Rome who would rather kill herself than be raped by the invaders. And here again, here she is. She is posed as Cleopatra, getting ready to take her own life with the bite of the asp, that's how you say that, snake, rather than be dragged back to Rome and humiliated. So these are powerful emotions, here she is again, that we begin to see emerge in the paintings and artwork of the Baroque period.